Wonderful, Felicia. Great to be with you. I mean, I know the three other speakers are much closer to the action in the US, so I want to sort of stand back and take three themes, that aren't maybe given enough attention, but I think was probably looking out into the future, they're going to gain that resonance. The first theme is kind of more of a conceptual component. If you know your mainstream IR theory, we recognize, or the literature recognizes, two kind of thrusts. And one of the thrusts is kind of aspirational towards multilateralism. The other is kind of the self-help, sovereignty-oriented choice. And most probably if the Democrats win, if Kamala Harris wins, we're going to go back to some sort of awkward equipoise between the two, kind of multilateralism, minilateralism, but also sovereignty, orientation maybe on the border and so on. If Trump wins, though, and this is going to be the focus, because I don't think we'd have such a big crowd if it wasn't such a maybe ominous or compelling election. If Trump wins, sovereignty is going to come to the forefront. And I think this is both important conceptually, but also important for almost every country around the world. My one kind of aspect of Canadian politics, of course, is that Canada has always dealt with the United States on this sort of mixture of multilateralism / sovereignty. And for some extent, in the first term of the Trump administration, maybe the only administration, is it can sort of see that there's been a fairly well-balanced approach for a while. Trump was managed by the Trudeau government to some extent by personality, to focus on the family, to focus on Ivanka, and in terms of kind of feminist entrepreneurship, but also maybe more structurally a skillful diplomacy in terms of renegotiation of NAFTA. By the end of the first Trump, though, things were beginning to unravel. And it was probably the first sign of this was the 2017 G7 meeting held in Quebec. And we can see this had a kind of a moment where Trump seemed to be satisfied at the G7. And then as he left, literally all hell breaks loose with charges of betrayal, of Canadian weakness, of Canadian, going back to 1812 and all sorts of different things. And we can see that those sort of shocks was probably are anticipatory for other shocks. I mean, certainly if Trump comes in, I won't spend any time on it, but we can see shocks on the NATO front in terms of Canadian perceived free riding, and of course, huge shocks waiting to happen on the border. I mean, we can just have all sorts of scenarios on the border. So that's the first theme, and I think most probably it's a theme that might be picked up in Q&A. The second theme, though, is probably the one that doesn't get, the attention is the choice of Trump on the institutional front. We certainly know what institutions Trump doesn't like. He doesn't like anything that's formal. I mean, if you go through the whole litany of formal institutions, I mean, certainly the 2017 remarks at the UN are the classic, but go through the roster, right? IMF, World Bank, WTO, COP, again, on and on and on. We can see that this is certainly one of the few fixed positions, I think, of Trump. And on that basis, we're certainly going to see a very different world if we have a second Trump term. That learning from the first one, we can see that those institutions are going to be very, very targeted. But I think was probably less noticed is that Trump also doesn't like the classic, what would you call, like-minded or solidarity institutions. And again, the reference to the G7, I think, is a good one. Trudeau is not the only one that, or not the only leader that comes into the crossfires of Trump at at the G7. Macron in 2019, another case, even though Macron was seen as kind of the Trump whistler, using the G7 to try to manage in a very sophisticated kind of French style of diplomacy. And again, it doesn't work for Macron. So the G7 sort of solidarity, like-mindedness can be contrasted with the not just the acceptance, but in some ways the embrace of a different form of informality by Trump. He likes the G20. He likes the transactional style, and maybe, as certainly going back to Fiona Hill's bio and so on, he likes dealing with a different set of leaders than is around the table. You can remember the picture of Trump at the G7 with Merkel and Abe and everybody looking at him in great frustration and distaste. Sitting around the G20, there's enough leaders that he can get on with, and he does get on with. You see repeatedly, even leaders that aren't the host of a G20, President Xi, for instance, he can sit down for dinner and cut some sort of deals. And of course, on the kind of strong people, or the autocrat leaders, the Erdogans of the world, or even the Modis, and now we have a new leader in Argentina and so on. The list sort of goes on and on. And indeed, in some way, if you're going to be facetious, there's probably Trump would be equally at home now at the BRICS, in terms of the sort of leaders he'd be sitting around the table with. So it's a strange world in terms of the classic American sort of institutional face or projection, away from the world of H.W. Bush and all sorts of leaders in the past. The third, because I don't want to go over my time, but it is something that's on my mind and certainly in future projects, is looking at Trump, if he does come back into office, and the world of diplomacy. And here I think we see a very problematic set of scenarios in terms of diplomacy. I think in that regard, the first administration can be very much seen as a sort of a trial run about the relationship of Trump through his various secretaries of state, and particularly the dealings with the State Department. And here I think we can see really the populist component of Trump really coming out in full force. The sense of there's a number of institutions or a number of sort of components of American life that there's a real distaste for, unless he can control those institutions. I mean, you can see the judges, unless, in that regard, it's the same as the Brexit types of people and many of the European kind of hard right, a real distaste of judges, of Supreme Court judges, and to some extent, and certainly in Trump's case, a distaste of central bankers as well. This sense that he's going to try to control finance and other components of the economy himself. But the diplomacy side really doesn't get the same attention it deserves. This isn't to say that there haven't been attacks by Republicans on diplomacy and diplomats in the past. One can think of the kind of hard right attacks on even Kissinger. I mean, not just a left-wing critique of Kissinger, but a right-wing critique that he'd kind of gone globalist, he'd gone soft on the Soviets, détente, and so on. But again, Trump is different, and we can see through the impeachment, through the attacks on diplomats, on ambassadors, through the Ukraine prism and so on. This is certainly going to be very different. And the last point, and not that you want to get into a sense of fixed scenarios and fixed conspiracies, but if you do spend some time looking at the 2025 project, this is probably the component of the project that, again, doesn't get the attention it deserves. If you look through the pages, there's going to be a full-on onslaught on State Department, on diplomacy. Certainly, it's going to be very different from the first term. And here it's just a question of whether it's eradication or a scenario of kind of going around and outsourcing diplomacy. Again, we're beginning to see lots of different components of both of those. So I think that's enough for me. I think we'll leave it to the others to chip in and have their own currents. But one can see that to use the adage from past finance crises, this time does seem to be different if Trump comes in. I don't think there's any sense that this is going to be anything except a disruptive approach. Certainly, this is going to have ripples into Canada, but it's going to have ripples through institutions around the world. It's also going to have ripples into the way we imagine and think of the practice of diplomacy. Thank you.
So I guess I'm supposed to just follow up on Professor Cooper. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And it's really fascinating to think about, U.S. foreign policy and this election and the context in terms of the globe. When I think about this, I think about three things in similar fashion. To Professor Cooper, one is we really have to understand the context in which this election is happening, right? So we have a global environment that is very different than it was when the first President Trump was elected, right? So one of the things I'll just point out about that particular context is that one, it's a pretty dangerous world if you have been paying attention to kind of what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, the potential for escalation into regional warfare is very, very much there. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I think there are certain actors in the Middle East who are actually actively looking for that escalation. We know that the Ukraine-Russian war rages on, and now we have North Korean forces engaged in that. So that has expanded in terms of who's involved. We also know that Sudan is blowing up and that there are some very serious human rights issues going on there. In addition, North Korea has been pretty aggressive lately and the Chinese are gearing up. So it's a dangerous world that whoever wins this election inherits, right? And things are quite unstable and there are a lot of unknowns. So given that particular context, I'd like to talk a little bit about, and I think, Alistair asked to go beyond the personalities, and I'm not quite sure that's possible in terms of thinking about Trump versus Harris. And that's because Trump is an exception. He's exceptional in that we've never quite seen a president engage in foreign policy like he does. His approach is very different. For a long time, we used to think of, politics stops at the water's edge and that foreign policy wasn't necessarily politicized. Now that, that has eroded and that's not necessarily a rule, but Trump has veered very hard during his presidency from 70 plus years of both Republicans and Democrats. And I think it's really important that we understand that. And so when I teach this, I usually teach about transactionalism. So Trump's approach, which has been very different, was transactional. And Professor Cooper mentioned that. So what does transactionalism mean? Transactional means that a simple way to think about this is every foreign policy is a deal and it's bilateral for country to country, right? So Trump likes to think about U.S. foreign policy with North Korea, not U.S. foreign policy with North Korea and the surrounding countries that might be relevant, right? He doesn't throw those actors into the soup, if you will. In terms of transactionalism, it's looking at leverage. He rejects the idea of interdependence. A lot of these issues, for example, Taiwan, is closely tied to other issues. And so he wants to think about U.S.-Taiwan issues. In fact, he's recently said, the Taiwanese should pay for the United States for their security, right? And not thinking about the implications for international law, for sovereignty, for global economic stability, for technology, for all these other things. And so it's kind of a very black and white rejection of issue independence. He also personalizes U.S. foreign policy, which I think is very different. So if you get along with him, then the United States and your country will do well, right? Which is we usually don't see presidents make it about my independent relationship with, and so we see this with the leader of North Korea. We see this with Vladimir Putin, right? There are many different places where that bilateral personality relationship is something that he deems as valuable. So the other thing, and this is a term I've been playing around with, we tend to think of American exceptionalism, but Trump really has, if I turn that term around, exceptional Americanism, right? So this is a hyper-nationalism, that America first, right? The United States first. And it's the exceptional Americanism is that the United States can exempt itself from all sorts of things like climate, economic interdependence, terrorism, global pandemics, right? That for some reason, somehow we can just build a wall and be exempt from all of these international interactions that and vulnerabilities and sensitivities to other things going on. In addition, that exceptional Americanism brings with it xenophobia. And so with that that's a new tint to U.S. foreign policy, in that there is this fear of others, fear of outsiders, whether they're African or Muslim or Puerto Rican. There is a long list of others that we should be afraid of or that we should disengage with, right? And so that's very exceptional. The other thing, and I do have a couple of slides, so I thought I'd just bring this in. Trump's very different in terms of most, pretty much all presidents to date have put their foreign policy teams together in terms of experts. And I remember George W. Bush, when he ran, right, he didn't have much foreign policy experience, but he loaded his team with folks that had worked for his father, right, the 41st president, right? So he basically says, yes, I'm a novice, but there's going to be a lot of experts that are going to help me with this very complex environment. And so don't worry, Colin Powell's here and Dick Cheney's here and others, Rumsfeld is here, and they will help me with this particular process. Trump did that in the beginning, but it's changed. So I do have I have a PowerPoint that I usually show to some of my students sometimes, and hopefully it's funny. This has changed a little bit in terms of, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get you to be able to see this. Can you see this? Is that something that's visible? Yes. Okay, excellent. So one of the things that we know about Trump's team, and I've got NSA for National Security Advisor, his approach is really, really different. One, in terms of disruptor in chief, which is something that people have talked about prior, he ran through kind of the A team, if you will, in terms of people that he hired to do this work. And then he ran through the A- team, and then he ran through the B+ team. And so, especially with National Security Advisor, in 4 years, he had 5 National Security Advisors. This is unheard of. He had 3 ambassadors to the United Nations. And for a long time, we had an interim ambassador to the UN. So we didn't actually have a UN ambassador, 2 secretaries of state, 3 secretaries of defense. It's just really, really different than anyone else. So, if you remember the Bush administration, again, there was so much consistency. Over 8 years, Bush had 2 national security advisors. And then the other thing I want to just point out, this I think is really fun and interesting visual about Trump's team in terms of making foreign policy and process versus the National Security Council. And here I have one under Obama. But, there are lots of seats at the table. You see the National Security Council is doing an interagency process where State Department is there, Department of Defense is there, Secretary of Treasury is there. All of these actors are in the room thinking about what is our goal? How do we coordinate policy, and how do we move the ball forward? With Trump, his National Security Council meetings were really media events, right? And it's much more formal. It's a lunch. It's not a working session. He's got his generals lined up. It's not inclusive, and it's really not a policymaking event. And so something to be thoughtful of. All right, and I think I'm just going to move on real quickly. I've got 2 other slides that I've been working on with my own research. And yes, this is going to get us a little bit boring, but it gets down to the nitty-gritty about Trump and multilateralism and what Trump actually did. So this first table that I have here is a list of threats of organizations, multilateral organizations. These are places where the United States has been key in terms of its leadership in each one of them. Some of them are agreements, but you see a threat to withdraw NAFTA, threat to withdraw from NATO, threats to withdraw from the World Trade Organization, withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is the Iranian nuclear deal. Threats to impose asset freezures on other countries for engaging with the International Criminal Court, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, withdrew from TPP, withdrew from the Global Compact on Migration, withdrew from the Global Compact on Refugees. And if we can dig down just a little bit deeper, my area of expertise is specifically at the UN. So in terms of UN agencies, and I won't go through all of these, but there was a huge effort to gut any U.S. contributions to so many UN agencies, UNICEF being one of them, UNRWA being another one, World Health Organization, UN AIDS, even the UN, the Postal Organization. So it's a really interesting kind of persistent withdrawal. So I'm just going to stop sharing there and come back a little bit. So when we think about this, there really is it's a very, very dramatic difference between these two leadership styles. And I'm happy to get into Q&A because I've been thinking about this in terms of the Middle East, in terms of US foreign policy with Russia, which actually I think can't be any different between Harris versus Trump. China, I was thinking about India as well, when some of the BRICS and some of the great powers, and I think that deserves a conversation. But one of the things that Trump is really kind of openly skeptical about are kind of American values. And so for liberal institutionalist or liberalism, and Professor Cooper brought that up about different approaches, the notion that the United States should project values of democracy, should support human rights, rule of law, international institutions. Again, there has been consistency since 1945 forward, with the exception of Trump, that those are things, at least lip service, that those are things that America should be doing. And Trump doesn't show any commitment whatsoever to human rights or anything like that. A really interesting moment happened a few weeks ago when Trump was talking about the situation in Gaza with Israel. So Harris talks about, women and children are dying and Israel has the right to defend itself, but we have to keep in mind the human rights violations. Trump, on the other hand, says this is not a good look. The bombs have to stop. So the focus is on the bombs. Israel needs to finish its business. So the notion of a human rights component to that particular conflict doesn't enter his narrative. And the same thing for Ukraine, the same thing for China. The list goes on. One of the other things, and I'll kind of end here, is that misinformation has to be part of this. We have to think about this. And there's some really interesting Pew polls out there about whether Americans care about U.S. foreign policy and what they care about. Within the United States, we're living in really different worlds. And part of that is because misinformation. So even what's going on in Russia or what's going on in the Middle East, the reality of it almost doesn't matter because Trump likes to use misinformation. It's one of his tools in his toolbox, right? And so that particular point for me is really, really significant, particularly when we're dealing with situations like what's going on within the Middle East, like the Ukraine, where there is so much uncertainty and trust levels are so low. And we've had this kind of weakening of international institutions. Even World Health Organization isn't really even allowed to engage right now in Gaza and stuff. There's so many places that is weak. And if you throw misinformation on top of that, it makes things, I think, very, very volatile. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's nice to meet you all. I'll try not to be too repetitive, given what my colleagues have already said, but my comments very much align with the sort of tone and content of their remarks. Just a couple of quick observations on what we can expect if Vice President Harris wins the election. And just to be clear, I very much hope she does, of course. I do think that there will be a good measure of continuity from the Biden administration to a future Harris administration. I think that'll be reflected in terms of policy and also in terms of personnel. I don't think that it'll be a sort of one-for-one, as a sort of a direct or perfect continuity in that sense. I do think that the incoming administration will try to take the opportunity that arises as a result of coming into office to sort of shift policy in a few areas. I think one of those areas is the Middle East, as Alina said a moment ago. And I think actually that clearly the Netanyahu administration anticipate that and are in an escalatory phase, anticipating that there might be some further US pressure coming down the track if Vice President Harris wins. I think that the future Harris administration will face many of the challenges that the Biden administration has faced at this moment, where the liberal international order that the US has brought into existence in the post-World War II period is under significant challenge. This is, I think, well documented in the literature, and certainly happy to talk more about that. But I think the primary objective of a Harris administration foreign policy will be to sort of preserve and sustain the liberal international order, which continues to serve the US and Canadian and Australian interests. I think and that will be the sort of key strategic goal of that administration, but it'll face significant challenges in doing that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. In terms of what a future US foreign policy will look like under a second Trump administration, sometimes it can be really difficult to pin Donald Trump down on policy. This is the guy that for many years was sort of pro-choice until he became the guy that could, win the favor of evangelicals and appoint these Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe versus Wade. One other example, this is the guy that without fear of being self-contradictory, rails against high tech and then has Elon Musk jumping around like a man-child at his rallies, right? There's just a knot of contradictions there. And I think the way to understand Trump in this regard and on foreign policy and in other spheres is exactly as my colleagues have mentioned. This is not a candidate that takes substantive positions in the way that traditional candidates do. I like the term transactionalism because transactionalism is a process, right? I mean, the way to understand Donald Trump is that you're not going to get a to-do list, not to paraphrase Kamala too much from her speech at the Ellipse the other night. But what you're going to get is a process where I think what fundamentally motivates Donald Trump is really very straightforward, which is, profit and ego, right? I think the best outcome of US foreign policy for Donald Trump would be a Trump hotel in, Riyadh and Moscow and every other capital, as well as, big bloody gold statues to Donald Trump, spotted across the United States and around the world, and his face on Mount Rushmore. I think that's what fundamentally drives this guy, which is why he flip-flops so much on policy. And why, it's difficult to predict how exactly it'll be a disaster under a second Donald Trump administration. But the instability that this calls into existence will almost certainly, result in conflict and injustice. So I do think I do agree with my colleagues that what we'll see is a lot of ad hocery, a lot of whimsical policy making, and that actually in preparing for thinking about my remarks for today, I went back and had a look at what people that are supportive of Donald Trump sort of have said about his foreign policy in the first term and how they try to sort of retrofit and sort of a coherent intellectual framework around it. And generally when they do, they talk about, peace through strength. They talk about Jacksonian realism, but I really think they're deluding themselves. I really think there's nothing more there than a leader that really wants to be admired and is looking to line his pockets in a way that's sort of, fundamentally corrupt. And difficult for many Americans to sort of get their head around in that regard. So to go a little bit further on that point, and I certainly agree with what Elena said a moment ago with regard to what we can expect in terms of who will implement Trump's policies. I expect again a lot of churn in the administration, as Elena said a moment ago. I think actually, however, that it may not matter who's churning through, because it'll be a bunch of sycophants or ideological hacks that will either implement sort of Trump's whims, or they won't, and they'll be shown the door. It's puzzling, I think, and I know this from speaking to people abroad, as to well, sorry, I understand why people abroad are confused as to why Americans support Donald Trump. And the sort of prevailing logic here at the moment is that there's two kinds of people that support him. The first that believe him, right? The people that listen to him speaking at a rally and can't wait for the wall to be built and can't wait for the detention camps and can't wait for, the MSNBC commentators to be rounded up and thrown in prison without trial and so forth, right? There's the really committed sort of MAGA people. But then there's a bunch of people that support him that don't believe him, right? That don't think those things are going to happen, right? That don't think it's plausible that the sort of wild things that he says about tariffs or about immigration and so on are actually going to happen, right? And I think that people use this distinction to describe sort of who might vote for Trump on Tuesday next week, but it also describes who might serve in his cabinet. So one sort of ideal type there is sort of Stephen Miller, who was the sort of shadow architect of the immigration policy in the first administration, and will either take on a role like that or a more prominent role in a second administration, one assumes. So that guy might have a longer shelf life in a Trump administration because he's a true believer and is on board and is an author of the agenda. But there's, the people of that second type, the ones that don't believe him, they're sort of the adults in the room, the ones that could exercise accountability or provide a guardrail. There's different terms that we use for this. They're not going to last long. They might not even emerge in the cabinet in the first place. And so I really do fear the worst in terms of, the who question and what that will mean for policy. As mentioned, I think that the implications for international politics are potentially vast. When I speak to my friends and family in Australia, I describe what's about to happen in the US possibly as like a great, terrible experiment. It's we're about to find out if the United States is going to become known to us as a fundamentally different country. Those two groups of Trump supporters are going to react really differently. If it happens that, in January, at the end of January next year, he tries to take away somebody's broadcasting license, or he does throw journalists in prison, right? Or he does slap tariffs on China that have this sort of wild inflationary effect and so on. If you actually take him at his word, the future could look very, very bleak for, domestically in this country, and it's going to be a big problem for, for those of us that are in middle power, from middle power countries and that rely on the United States for our security and our prosperity. I do think in terms of looking at conflict situations around the world, I very much expect that Trump means what he says when he thinks that he can settle the Ukraine conflict, within 48 hours or whatever ridiculous claim that he made. And I think that that's a fairly clear indication that he intends to settle that in Russia's favor. In the Middle East, he has this sort of very sort of strange position with regard to Israel and with regard to Jewish voters within the United States. On the one hand, he slips into some very, terrible anti-Semitism on occasions, and you saw the comedian at his rally the other day that doesn't hesitate to put on the record anti-Semitic jokes that would, in the past, have never been made, let alone at Madison Square Garden at the rally for the Republican candidate. Really beyond the pale. At the same time, I think Benjamin Netanyahu has Trump in his pocket, and that actually the we put Joe Biden aside for one moment, but there's I've been actually quite surprised by the scale of Israeli ambition in responding to October the 7th, and the willingness of Israel to seek conflict on, or to engage in conflict on, multiple fronts, and I do think that would continue under a second Trump administration, very much so. As for conflict in other parts of the world, I'm not sure that this administration would take that much of an interest. I think that they would like to keep American soldiers, out of conflict situations in parts of the world that they perceive don't really matter. One sort of strange effect of a second Trump administration is that we have a world that's maybe more peaceful in terms of the reduction of conflict, but far less just, as other great powers, the Russians and the Chinese and etc., are more influential or assert their interests in other parts of the world that are where the US, I think, would withdraw, because at the core of that America First sort of ideology is a sense of American isolationism. And just to wrap up, I think, again, the consequences for countries like Canada and my own country, Australia, are potentially extremely grave. And I do hope that, people in Ottawa, as I hope that people in Canberra are sort of thinking through the implications of this, because, we've known and loved and relied on the Americans for many, many years. but our friend might be about to go wonky. And what do you do in that situation? It's really, I think, a massive generational challenge for foreign policy makers in countries like yours and mine.
So again, thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it. I remember back when the 2020 election happened, I got a commitment from Alistair that all of us in the U.S. could crash on his couch in case the election goes south. So I'm going to hold you to that. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to take a broader historical perspective on this, partly because that's what I've been doing in my research, and I think it also might help us determine whether this is a pivotal election and even whether the outcome matters. So I've come to the conclusion that international organizations are not able to craft norms and values to the extent that we used to think. I remember I started this research in the 1980s and was very happy to be have a front row seat during the 1990s when there was all this blush of idealism and enthusiasm, renewal, revitalization of the United Nations, and so forth. And there was a lot of research that indicated that the UN could actually generate ideas which then governments would embrace, and it would change the way they behave and change the nature of the conversation and so forth. Rather, I think that international organizations are sort of like cars on the road, but they don't get to build the road. The road is being built, I think, by the great powers. Usually there's only a handful of them, and they establish the parameters within which international organizations can function. If you go back to, say, the 1990s, there was a period where we had a unipolar system, which is both scary and encouraging. All depends on who that unipolar country is. So now we're in more of a tripolar system, and that seems pretty fundamental. I don't think that's going to change for a decade or two. And again, what matters most is what these three major powers are. And one of the things that I find really important is the domestic institutions and norms and the values that each country brings to the table. You had, during the 90s, a fairly liberal, open United States that was interested in human rights, interested in free trade, interested in multilateralism, and that was reflected in kind of resurgence and renewal that we saw at the UN with multilateralism generally. Lots of conferences, lots of new agreements. It was a heyday. But then over time, as China has become much, much stronger, its GDP grew eightfold in the last 20 years, as Russia has become increasingly autocratic, and China as well, we're now in a position where two of the members of the Security Council are skeptical, at the very least, or outright hostile to liberal norms, to the rule of law, to multilateralism, and so forth. Russia, of course, there was just a report, I think it was this morning on NPR, has been committing atrocities. There's an article in today's New York Times about 100 detention camps in Ukraine. This is more than just being frustrated by the inconvenience of human rights. This is a full-on assault against basic norms and principles. China's attitude about the South China Sea and so forth. These are almost to the point of being radical revisionist states, but they're extremely powerful. Between them, Russia and China have about 6,000 nuclear weapons and millions of troops. In that situation, where you have two very large autocratic states, the question is, what can a liberal democratic major power do? And I think one of the things we're seeing with Ukraine is that there's just a limit to what the West is going to be able to do. I can understand why Trump would want to just get rid of the issue. take it off the table. But even without Trump, Harris is going to have a really hard time dealing with the Ukraine situation as well. Nobody has got an appetite for a direct war with Russia. I'm not sure that I would advise that either. And you're starting to see some shifting. Russia and China are coming closer. We had the BRICS events in Moscow not long ago, where we had this, as Trump would say, a love fest for Vladimir Putin, and it's sort of maybe consolidating into an anti-Western coalition. We have new agencies like well, the BRICS, of course, but also the AIIB and the New Development Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, that are pulling a lot of countries, especially from the global south, into the Russian and Chinese orbit. In a situation like that, the United States absolutely has to be fully committed to liberalism, down to its core, down to its essence, because that's the only thing that can hold back this tide. And I think that Harris is in that vein. I think that she's committed to democracy, to the rule of law, balance of power, checks and balances within government. I should have said. Trump, however, is simply not. And I think another Trump administration could fundamentally change American democracy. Already we're seeing it with a lot of Trump supporters with respect to basic civil rights, with respect to the rule of law. I thought that his convictions for, felonies would be a deal breaker. Oh no, any more than all the other accusations or indictments or impeachments. I mean, he has proven that there's a very large number of Americans who apparently just don't care about the rule of law, don't care about civil rights, and as long as they get what they want, whether it's a reduction of abortion or whether it's constraining trans or gay people, they don't really care about the process anymore. And they clearly are not committed to free trade, although even the Biden administration has had some misgivings about free trade as well. But I just think that if Trump wins, there's a real possibility that some of this anti-democratic mood that we have in the country will become institutionalized in a way that is very difficult to change. We already see some of this with the current Supreme Court. Likely there'll be more Trump supporters appointed to the court if he is elected. And in that situation, I'm not even sure that Trump's personality matters all that much, because the United States will become an ambivalent country with respect to liberalism, freedom, and all of this. And at the very least, the United States will continue what happened in the first Trump administration, and even to some degree with the Biden administration, will simply withdraw from multilateralism and create a vacuum, as has often been mentioned, especially by New York Times columnists, create a vacuum into which China and Russia will step, that the norms will simply begin to evaporate. There's a legal term called desuetude, right, where this will simply become a historical artifact that, oh yeah, I remember when we used to have a liberal international order, rule of law. And I'm just very concerned about that. And I'm grateful that I'm able to speak to a Canadian audience in particular, because I remember, and I'm not trying to be dark just because it's Halloween, but it reminds me a little bit of the way Jewish congregations would make sure before the Nazis came that they would wrap up the Torah and take it someplace safe and keep it under wraps until the Nazis were finally gone. I actually believe that there is a tremendous role to be played by Canada, Australia, the Nordic countries, all of the like-minded liberal democratic states, that it may be left to them to preserve these principles and institutions, beliefs and values and norms, even though they may not be able to make them manifest for a little while. It's possible that we need to wait for Putin to die. It may be that the Chinese economy will implode, which seems like a 50-50 proposition. Maybe Americans will be repelled by what the Trump administration does and have a come to Jesus moment and say never again. I don't know what it would take, but like I said, my biggest concern is that the U.S. is going to become an enabler of these two massive autocratic states, in which case I think that the whole liberal international order is very much in jeopardy, and we may need these, the next tier of states, the Western Europeans and so forth, to keep the flame alive and to keep things going and to be ready to step in and maybe restore some of these extremely valuable and precious norms and values. So please don't give up. We need you. And that's what